Folks around the hills will tell you, the devil don't always wait outside the church door. Sometimes he walks in right alongside the congregation. Sometimes he sits quiet in the pews, listening to the hymns, waiting for the moment when faith turns into fear. And when that happens, even the holiest place in a holler can become the most dangerous place a body could be. It was a bitter February night in 1933. Snow still clung to the black ridges of Martin County, and the wind whistled through the hollers like it had a voice of its own. Inside a small wooden church near Tomahawk, lanterns flickered along the walls while a crowd of believers packed in tight. They'd come for salvation. They'd come to shake the devil out of their lives. But before the night was over, one soul would lie dead on the church floor, killed by her own son. While the congregation watched in a frenzy they swore was the Spirit of the Lord. You've wandered into Kentucky Melody, where we tell the strange, the haunted, and the true stories buried deep in the hills and hollers of the bluegrass. Tonight's story takes us into the mountains of Martin County, Kentucky, where one revival meeting during the Great Depression turned into something so shocking, newspapers across the entire country wrote about it. But the folks who lived through it, they didn't call it history. They called it the night the devil stepped into the church.
Someone order a college degree program? There's a college in there? Hey, I just deliver life upgrades. Sign here.
Okay, what did I order? Campus. This is nice. I didn't know enrolling in campus came with perks like this.
Okay, campus.edu, I see you. Free laptop, fresh swag. This isn't just a college, this is a whole vibe.
And look at this. Campus's business professors also teach at top-ranked universities like Princeton and Stanford. And
most of their business students haven't had to pay a dime in out-of-pocket tuition costs. Ready to unbox your future? Just apply today for free at campus.edu.
Termites.
Back in 1933, Martin County was a hard place to live. The hills were black with coal dust, and the hollers felt tighter than ever, with the Great Depression squeezing the life out of every home tucked between those ridges. Men rose before daylight, hoping to find work that day, and many nights they walked back down the muddy roads with empty pockets and heavier hearts. Coal camps went quiet. Store ledgers filled with unpaid debts, and more than one kitchen table sat bare except for a pot of beans stretched thin enough to feed a family that hadn't tasted meat in weeks. You could smell the hardship in the air. The scent of coal smoke drifted through the valleys like a gray fog that never quite lifted. Old cabins creaked in the winter wind, their chimneys coughing out weak trails of smoke that barely held the cold at bay. Men worked when they could, and when they couldn't, they worried. Women did what mountain women had always done, stretching flour, salt pork, and whatever the garden might still offer into meals that could keep children alive through another week. Some nights, supper was little more than cornbread and hope. And when hope itself started running thin, folks turned to the church, not just for prayer, for relief. Revival meetings became the one place in the holler where people could forget the hunger gnawing at their stomachs and the worry gnawing at their minds. Lanterns would glow late into the night while families gathered shoulder to shoulder in those small wooden churches, singing until their voices cracked and their spirits lifted. But these weren't quiet services, not the kind where folks sat polite and still with folded hands. No, These were holiness revivals, Pentecostal fire, the kind of meetings where the preacher thundered from the pulpit until sweat soaked his collar and his voice rasped raw from shouting about sin, salvation, and the devil lurking just outside the door. Tambourines clattered like thunder in the rafters. Boots stomped hard against the wooden floorboards until the whole building trembled. Women cried out in prayer. Men shouted, "Amen," loud enough to echo through the holler, and sometimes people fell, dropped straight to the floor in what they swore was the power of the Holy Ghost. Some writhed, some wept, others spoke in strange tongues that sounded like a language no one on earth had ever learned. In those moments, the air inside those little churches felt charged, thick, almost electric. People believed the Spirit moved through those rooms like a storm wind sweeping down from the mountains. But if you stood there long enough, listening to the voices rise higher and higher, watching bodies shake and lantern flames flicker in the dark corners, you might begin to wonder something else entirely. Whether the power rushing through that room was truly heaven touching the earth, or something older, something darker, slipping in through the door while everyone's eyes were closed in prayer. The revival in Tomahawk had already been running 7 straight nights. By the time that last evening rolled around, the people filing into that little church looked worn thin as old fence wire. Eyes hollow, voices hoarse. Some of them hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. A little cornbread here, maybe a bowl of beans there, but nothing enough to quiet the hunger twisting in their stomachs. And sleep. Sleep had become a stranger. Many of them stayed up late every night praying, singing, or walking the cold roads between the scattered homes in the holler, whispering to neighbors about what they'd seen the night before. Because the preacher kept telling them something was building, something powerful. Every night he promised the Spirit would come stronger. Every night he said the Lord was drawing nearer. So even though their bones ached and their stomachs growled, they kept coming back, night after night, until that 7th evening. The church filled early. Lanterns hung along the walls, their small flames trembling in the draft that crept through the cracks in the boards. Their light threw long shadows across the pews, making the room seem deeper than it really was. The smell of kerosene drifted thick in the air, mixed with sweat, mixed with the sharp, oily scent of anointing oil rubbed across foreheads and trembling hands. And when the singing started, it started soft, just a hymn, old voices rising together the way they always had. But as the night stretched on, the singing grew louder, faster, rougher. Hymn after hymn rolled through that little church until the music didn't sound like singing anymore. It sounded like pleading, like a room full of desperate souls calling upward into the dark, begging heaven to hear them. Hands lifted, tambourines rattled, boots stomped hard against the floorboards, and then people began to fall. One woman collapsed first, dropping to her knees with a cry that cut through the room like a blade. Another man followed, his body shaking so violently 2 others had to catch him before he struck the floor. Some wept, some trembled, some rocked back and forth, whispering prayers so fast the words tangled together, and others began speaking in strange tongues that rolled out of their mouths in sounds no one there could understand. The room filled with noise. Prayers, cries, shouts, voices stacking over voices until the whole church seemed to tremble with it. And somewhere inside that chaos, somewhere between the flickering lantern light and the rising storm of voices, something in the room shifted, not loud, not sudden, but real enough that more than one person later swore they felt it, like the air itself had thickened, like something unseen had stepped quietly into the church and was standing there among them.
Turns out you should never sue the driver who crashed into you after a car accident. There's a much better way you could get paid a way bigger check without suing, without going...
Among the congregation that night sat Lucinda Mills, 72 years old, a widow who had weathered more winters in those hills than most folks cared to count. Time had bent her shoulders a little and silvered her hair, but her spirit hadn't dimmed. People in the holler knew Lucinda as one of the most faithful women in Martin County. The kind who never missed a service unless sickness pinned her to the bed. Her Bible stayed close by her side wherever she went. The leather cover had grown soft from years of handling, the pages worn thin and yellowed from decades of turning them under lamplight. Folks said she knew whole passages by heart, and when she prayed, she spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who truly believed the Lord was listening. And when Lucinda Mills lifted her voice in song, even that night, even at 72, it rose above the others like a clear bell ringing through the room, sweet, steady, familiar to everyone there. But sitting only a few pews away that night was her son, John H. Mills, and something about him didn't sit right. People noticed it later when they tried to piece together the night, the way he watched her, not the way a son usually looks at his mother during a revival meeting. There was no warmth in his face, no pride when her voice carried through the room. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed on her in a way that made a few people uneasy. A long, unblinking stare that didn't seem to follow the music or the preacher's words. Witnesses would later say there was a strange tension in his expression, like he was studying her, like he was searching for something in her face that only he believed he could see. Not like a son watching his mama sing in church. More like a man staring at something coiled in the grass. Something he feared. Or something he hated. Or worse yet, something he believed shouldn't be there at all. No one can agree exactly when it began. Later, when folks tried to remember the moment everything turned, the stories came out different. Some said it started with the preacher. By that point in the night, his voice had grown raw from shouting. His face flushed in the lantern light as he pounded the pulpit and warned the congregation about evil lurking among the faithful. "Sometimes the devil," he cried, "don't come from outside these doors. He hides among us. He hides in plain sight." Others said it wasn't the preacher at all. They believed it was the crowd itself. A room full of people pushed past the limits of exhaustion, hungry, sleepless, and wound so tight with emotion that every shout and prayer only tightened the knot a little more. The kind of tension where fear begins to move through a room like a cold draft, where people start looking sideways at one another, wondering who among them might be carrying darkness. But whatever spark lit the fire, it found its way straight into John Mills. Something in his mind caught hold of that idea and wouldn't let go. Suddenly, he pushed himself to his feet in the middle of the service. The Zennin stumbled and faltered as heads turned toward him. His chest heaved as if he'd been running. His hands trembled, and when he spoke, his voice came out sharp and shaking. His eyes were wide, wild, like a man who had just seen something no one else in the room could see. Then he shouted the words that would freeze the entire church in place. "The devil is here." The room went still. Lantern flames flickered against the walls. No one spoke. Then John pointed. Not toward the door, not toward the pulpit, but straight across the room, at his own mother. His voice cracked as he cried out again, louder this time. "The devil's hiding inside her." For a moment, the congregation just stared. Some gasped aloud. Others began whispering frantic prayers under their breath. A few shook their heads in disbelief. But something strange had already taken hold of the room, because in that moment, the line between faith and fear had begun to disappear. And once that line vanishes, it doesn't take much for belief to turn into something far more dangerous. John moved. Not slowly, not with hesitation. He lunged. One moment he stood there trembling in the aisle, and the next he was across the floor, crashing into the pew where Lucinda sat. His hands shot out and closed around her throat. For the briefest second, the congregation didn't understand what they were seeing. In those revivals, folks often rushed forward to lay hands on someone believed to be struggling with spirits or sin. It wasn't uncommon for bodies to thrash, for men to shout and grab shoulders while praying the devil out of a soul. So, at first, many thought that's what it was. Another burst of holy fervor, another soul being wrestled free from darkness. But then Lucinda's eyes flew open wide. Her hymn stopped in mid-breath. A thin rasp clawed its way out of her throat as John's grip tightened, and the truth hit the room all at once. Lucinda struggled. Her frail hands clawed desperately at her son's wrists, her fingers trembling as they scraped against his skin. Her feet kicked against the wooden floorboards, heels knocking against the pew with dull thuds that echoed through the church. People shouted. A woman screamed. Two men rushed forward, trying to grab John's shoulders and pull him back. But others, caught in the fever of the revival, dropped straight to their knees instead. They prayed louder, faster, voices rising in frantic waves as if sheer faith might somehow break whatever madness had taken hold of him. The preacher shouted for the devil to leave. Tambourines clattered to the floor. Lantern lights swung wildly as someone bumped a hanging hook, shadows lurching across the walls like dark shapes scrambling to escape. But the frenzy had already taken hold of the room, and inside that storm of shouting and prayer, John Mills never let go. Lucinda's strength faded quickly. Her struggling slowed. Her hands slipped weakly from his wrists. Then, within only a few terrible moments, Lucinda Mills collapsed. Her body sagged against the wooden floorboards as the grip finally loosened. Her gray hair spread across the planks beneath the flickering lantern light, silver strands catching the glow in a way that looked almost like a halo. And just like that, the shouting stopped. The prayers stopped. Even the lantern flames seemed to hold still. The little church that had been roaring with voices only seconds before fell into a stunned, breathless silence. What happened next may be the most chilling part of the entire story, because in a room full of witnesses, in a room full of people who had just watched a woman die, very few rushed forward to help. For a moment, the congregation simply stood there, breathing hard, staring down at Lucinda's still body, as if the answer to what had just happened might somehow rise from the floorboards. And then something stranger happened. Some of them began to believe John. The words he had shouted only minutes earlier still hung in the air like smoke. The devil is inside her. Fear had already taken hold of the room, and fear has a way of twisting belief into something dangerous. A few people whispered to one another. Others looked at Lucinda's lifeless body as though they expected it to move, as though the darkness John spoke of might still be lurking there. And slowly, that terrible idea began to spread. They told themselves evil had been inside her, that the devil had hidden in her flesh, and if that was true, then perhaps the only way to make sure it never returned was to purge it completely, through sacrifice. The crowd began moving almost without thinking, like a group of sleepwalkers sharing the same dream. Hands reached down and lifted Lucinda's body from the floor. Her heels dragged softly against the boards as they carried her down the narrow aisle toward the altar. The lantern light flickered across her pale face, her gray hair swaying gently with each step. They laid her across the rough wooden table at the front of the church, the same altar where prayers had been spoken and hymns sung only moments before. But now that altar looked different, colder, darker. One man stepped outside and returned with armfuls of kindling from the woodpile near the stove. Another lifted a kerosene lantern from its hook. The flame inside wavered as he tipped it slowly forward. Thick oil spilled out in dark, glistening streams, soaking into Lucinda's dress and dripping across the altar boards beneath her. The smell filled the room instantly. Sharp, oily, dangerous. Somewhere in the back of the church, a woman began to cry, but no one stopped, because by then the congregation had convinced themselves they were doing something righteous, something necessary. They prepared to burn her body right there inside the church, not as a murder anymore, but as an offering, as a cleansing, as something they truly believed God Himself would accept. But the hills carry sound. On a still winter night in Martin County, a shout can travel clear across a holler and up the next ridge like it's riding the wind itself. And not far from that little church in Tomahawk, a neighbor sitting in his cabin heard something that made him stop cold. At first, he thought it was just the revival. The singing had been carrying through the valley all week long. Hymns rolling through the darkness while lanterns burned late inside the church. But this was different. These weren't steady hymns. They weren't the rising swell of prayer. What drifted through the night was jagged, broken, voices shouting over one another in a way that sounded less like worship and more like panic, something wild, something wrong. The man stepped outside onto the frozen ground, listening again as the wind carried another burst of shouting down the holler. That was enough for him. He saddled up and rode hard through the dark toward town, his horse's hooves striking sparks against the frozen road as he went to fetch the law. Not long after, 2 county deputies pushed open the church door. The sound of it creaking on its hinges seemed to slice straight through the noise inside. Before they even stepped across the threshold, the smell hit them. Kerosene. Sharp. Heavy. Strong enough to sting the nose. Lantern light flickered against the walls as the deputies looked across the room, and what they saw made both men stop dead in their tracks. Lucinda Mills lay stretched across the altar, her body stiff, her gray hair spread across the wood like pale strands of wire. Dark kerosene soaked into the cloth of her dress, glistening under the lantern light. A small pile of kindling sat stacked nearby, and on the altar beside her, a box of matches. Around the body stood the congregation, a tight ring of silent figures, faces pale, eyes wide, hands trembling as if they'd only just realized what they had nearly done. And standing closest to the altar was John Mills, his head bowed slightly, his lips still moving, whispering prayers under his breath as if the terrible thing that had just happened was part of some holy ritual. The deputies didn't hesitate. They rushed forward, grabbing him by the arms and wrenching him away from the altar. John struggled only a little as they dragged him backward across the floor. Then the cold snap of iron echoed through the church as handcuffs closed around his wrists. In that moment, whatever strange spell had gripped the room finally broke. The whispers stopped. The prayers died on people's lips. And the little church that had been roaring with voices only minutes before fell into a deep, stunned silence. The story didn't stay in Martin County for long. By the next morning, it had begun spreading like wildfire across the country. Telegraph wires hummed with the news. Newspapers from Louisville to New York splashed the headlines across their front pages. Human sacrifice in the Kentucky hills. Reporters poured into Martin County almost overnight, their automobiles grinding slowly along the narrow dirt roads that wound through the mountains. They came from cities most folks in the holler had never even seen. Men in long coats carrying notebooks and cameras, asking questions in sharp northern accents. They scribbled down every detail they could find. And many of them wrote the story the way outsiders had always written about the mountains. To them, Tomahawk wasn't a quiet Appalachian community. It was proof of something darker. Their stories painted the hills as a place ruled by superstition, where religion and fear could twist together until people lost their senses. They described the congregation as wild-eyed mountain folk, gripped by hysteria and ancient beliefs that civilized towns had long since left behind. But the people who actually lived there, they knew the truth wasn't that simple. They knew those families. They had prayed beside them, shared meals with them, raised children together in the same hard country. And what happened that night didn't feel like superstition. It felt like something far more frightening. A moment when hunger, exhaustion, fear, and faith collided all at once. And something inside the room snapped. When the trial finally began, the courtroom filled quickly. Curious townspeople packed the benches while reporters leaned forward with pencils ready, waiting to hear how a man could kill his own mother inside a church. John H. Mills sat quietly at the defense table. He showed little emotion, no anger, no grief, no regret. When the time came for him to speak, he told the court the same thing he had said that night in the church, his voice steady, almost calm. He said he believed his mother had been possessed by the devil, and that by killing her, he had saved her soul. The courtroom fell silent when he finished, but the jury didn't hesitate. To them, this wasn't a battle with evil spirits. It was murder, cold and undeniable. They returned their verdict quickly. Guilty. John